awful things that are getting triggered here, or maybe you even have bigger stuff than that, like in your family. And it's triggering this stuff, and that's why these parts are getting upset, because they're like, oh, we've been down this road before. It doesn't go well. It doesn't feel good. Hi, I'm Jen Barnes, and you're about to experience how to ditch the old ways of doing things, embrace your neurodivergence, learn tips and tricks to function optimally, and love yourself, neurodivergence and all. Welcome to the Self-Loved Woman podcast. Hey, it's Jen. I'm so glad you're here. Today we're going to talk about a really important topic, especially for ADHD. You know, one piece of ADHD is emotion dysregulation. It's really common for our emotions to be all over the place, or, to feel like they're out of our control. And yet, in order for us to function, it is essential that we figure out how to regulate our emotions so that we really can function as optimally as possible in this neurotypical world not designed for us. So I want to dig into some of the neuroscience here because it's relevant and it's really important to understand, especially with ADHD and growing up in this neurotypical world. Like I said, that wasn't designed for us because, like it or not, that's trauma. You might be thinking, oh, Jen, no, only getting robbed or raped or, almost murdered is trauma, or being abused as a child is trauma. But the truth is there are things like that sure, you know what? Anyone would consider them trauma. Anyone would go, oh yeah, that's traumatic. But trauma is all relative to the person. And a lot of times what can be very traumatic is daily criticism, daily, shaming, verbal abuse, daily lack of acceptance for how you are in the world, for people expecting you to be something you're not and feeling, getting mad at you or disappointed when you're not meeting up to their expectations. That also can be traumatic, especially over time. And it leads to not only, those negative self-talk messages about how we're not good enough, or we just need to try harder. We're not reaching our full potential because we're not doing it right, or whatever that is, as well as a dysregulated nervous system. A nervous system that has gone through trauma, whether that trauma is something more extreme, like I started in the opening, or it's that daily lack of acceptance from society of not being right, not being able to do it right, get it right, whatever. That is trauma too. And our nervous system doesn't know the difference. This is what's crazy. Our nervous system does not know the difference between a tiger chasing us and an eye roll or nasty comment to us on Facebook. Like, it doesn't. It just goes fight or flight response and, perceived threat. Now, because we're human, we have this part of our brain that can think and plan and reflect and learn and grow in a way that perhaps other animals can't, at least not that we know of. And so the cool thing is we can work with these thoughts. We can work with the stuff that comes up for us. We can release the trauma so that those messages, that energy, and that trauma is released from our body, our thoughts, and our experiences, instead of weighing us down and making it even harder to function than it already is in this neurotypical world. So I'm excited to share some thoughts on that today. I want to start, like I said, with the neuroscience. So here's the deal. Little bit of background on the autonomic nervous system. It is a very primitive system. Even reptiles have it. So when we think about this, there's not a lot of thinking involved in our responses to trauma. When we think about it, there's not a lot of sophistication to how our brains, our bodies deal with things that we perceive as a threat. Our autonomic nervous system is what handles it, and that is a very primitive system. So let's get into it. So the first piece piece of our autonomic nervous system that has a job for keeping us safe by keeping us connected to others, right? Evolutionarily speaking, we need to be connected to our tribe to be safe, is the ventral vagal system, right? The ventral vagal response. Our ventral vagal response helps keep us safe by keeping us connected to other humans, by staying with the tribe, because alone it can be very hard going out in the wilderness where we originally were, right? So when we are ventral vagal, we feel safe enough to connect, we can rest and digest, and all of our other systems are online. So it's essential that we are in our ventral vagal response as much as possible so that we can function the way that our bodies are meant to function. The hard part is number one, just in our society in general, where we're faced with all this really hard stuff coming up lately, and especially all the access to the hard stuff, right? Like, we know way more than we used to. I don't know that things are all that worse. And if you doubt that, check out Future Crunch, by the way. Excellent newsletter for all the awesomeness that's going on. Not in a like gross toxic positivity kind of way, but just in a way that helps us realize like not everything is doomed on the planet. But, back off the rails. Because we're exposed to all this information and we hear about all these bad things happening, it's already hard enough for our nervous systems to stay regulated, to stay ventral vagal. And just so you know, the goal isn't to be ventral vagal our entire lives. That's not possible, let alone even expected. So it's more that we want to be able to be in that state enough so that our body, our systems can function optimally. And so we can be connected to other people because we need connection to survive. We know that. There's so much research behind that. The thing is trauma, things like the news, chronic stress, all of that can pull us more regularly out of our ventral vagal response. So what we want to be able to do is notice when we're not in our ventral vagal response and do something to bring us back when it's safe enough to do so. So let's get more into this. What happens is we'll be going along ventral vagal. And sometimes, if we've got trauma histories, we're more likely to be bouncing back and forth between our fight or flight response and our shutdown response. And I'll talk more about each of those later. But if we're not bouncing back between those responses, we might find ourselves more ventral vagal. And then all of a sudden we perceive a threat. Like I said, it could be a nasty comment on Facebook. It could be someone clucking their tongue at us. It could be someone flipping us off when we're driving. Or it could be like a rabid dog or something coming after us, right? These can be perceived or real threats, but either way, it doesn't matter because our nervous system is like, oh, we've got to get to safety. We've got to be safe. And so the first stop there is our fight or flight response, the sympathetic nervous system. And so when we bounce into our fight or flight response, we're flooded with chemicals like adrenaline, noradrenaline, also known as norepinephrine, and cortisol. And that helps us be able to fight or flee, which is what you want to do if you're facing actual danger. But the problem is a lot of times, in these situations, like with a nasty Facebook comment, fighting isn't usually going to help the situation. At least I've experienced that it doesn't. I don't know, maybe you've had Facebook fights with people online and found that fruitful. I never have. And fleeing isn't always beneficial either, though sometimes it can be. So what we want to do is notice when we've been triggered and be able to get ourselves back to that ventral vagal response. Now, in some situations, if we feel like the danger isn't going away or we're not able to get ourselves to safety, then our nervous system is like, shit, all hell is breaking loose. We're just going to have to shut down and prepare for the worst. And it does. Our nervous system is like, okay, here we go. We're going to prepare for the worst. And it shuts us down, numbing us out, helping us get disconnected so that we don't feel emotional or physical pain, which is a good thing. Evolutionarily speaking, like if you were going to be eaten alive by a tiger, you probably don't want to feel that either physically or emotionally. So our brain, our nervous system shuts us down to protect us. A lot of times though, if it's more of a perceived threat than a real ongoing threat where we're like actually going to be killed, that shutdown response isn't always useful long term. So again, we want to learn how to regulate. There are many ways to regulate from these two states, but ultimately, I want to talk about the overarching principle to help you be able to come up with things that work best for you. So in our shutdown response, when we're feeling numb, disconnected, dissociative, because the shutdown response, dorsal vagal response, is protection through immobilization, any movement at all is going to help us come out of that state. Now, we should know that one, we want to make sure we're safe enough to be out of that state. And two, sometimes when we come out of the shutdown response, we can go into our fight or flight response. So we want to make sure we have a plan for if that happens and how we might be able to regulate from there. But movement of any kind, even visualizing movement, can help us shift from the dorsal vagal shutdown response out of that state. So, what are things that involve movement? Visualizing movement can do it if you can't get yourself to do anything. Going for a walk, doing some kind of yoga or, running, swimming, anything at all, biking, can get you out of that state. And you might be thinking like, but Jen, when I'm in my shutdown response, I don't want to do any of those things. And that's why visualizing movement can sometimes be helpful. It can also be helpful to look out your window, to connect with nature, hug a tree, like for real, hug a tree. If you're feeling shut down, especially if you have ADHD, you might be more sensitive to feeling the energy. And so I find hugging a tree, like I can just feel their strength, just their life force, and that can actually help pull me out of that shutdown response. Other things can be, those exercise balls, sitting on one of those if you happen to have one, because there's micro movements involved in being able to stay upright that will help get you out of that shutdown response. Another thing to think about in that response, once we're no longer in our shutdown response, we might catch ourselves in our fight or flight response, or maybe we never got to our shutdown response and we're just in our fight or flight response. So to get out of this state when it's safe enough to do so, we need fluid movement with breath. And the reason we need fluid movement with breath is this is a state of mobilization to get us to safety, but it's often more frenetic mobilization to get us to safety versus like a intentional movement with breath. So fluid movement with breath is what's going to help us shift out of this state. So a yoga sun salutation, right? You can do like a full one or a seated one. My favorite thing to teach is volcano breathing. So that's one. Stay tuned on my TikTok, by the way. I've been offering that as a freebie. So make sure you look at that on TikTok. I'll share it in the show notes too. I'll make sure I share that. So volcano breathing is a good one. There's even, like a full yoga practice would be great. But movement with breath, anything that's fluid movement with breath, swimming actually would be great here because it is so rhythmic and intentional with the breath, right? I mean, if you're doing laps, probably if you're just like, thrashing around in the pool, I don't know if that's going to do it for you. But that will help you get out of this response. Another thing to consider is not just the somatic experience of being dysregulated, but also emotional dysregulation. Because a lot of times we ADHDers can find ourselves emotionally dysregulated. And yeah, it ties very closely to what we've been talking about with the autonomic nervous system. But there's another piece that sometimes we need to work with to really help with it. And it's being able to recognize the parts of ourselves that are upset, working with them, understanding their concern, validating their feelings and concern, and then figuring out like, okay, what do we need to do instead? And that's one of my favorite things to teach in my program. I'll kind of run over it here real quick. But basically you notice like, oh, hey, there's a part of me that's really hurt by this comment on Facebook. And I notice that in my body. I notice it in my chest. That's funny. I actually do notice it in my chest thinking about a past time when that happened. And being like, oh yeah, I feel that part. I see that part. And you know what? Of course, this part is upset because this part doesn't want me to be hurt. And then as I say that, I have another part who's like, well, F those mother effers. Cause you know what? Like, it's not even about being hurt. They don't get to talk to us that way. And that's great. That's helpful too, right? Like we have all these protectors. And the urge a lot of us feel, and the thing that really, especially if you're a Gen Xer or older, probably a millennial too, that we've been taught is that we need to be like, nope, I just need to move past that. I can't be angry about that. I'm fine. It's fine. Brush it off. Or even, there's no reason to be sad about that. I can't let the haters get to me. And yeah, all of that is true, but there's some important first steps that need to happen. And like I said, the first one is noticing that we're feeling something. So when we get that negative comment, it's like, oh, that feels like, my chest tightened and like a punch in my gut. And instead of reacting, closing Facebook, or whatever you use, TikTok, Instagram, and working with the feelings that are coming up because they're valid. Nobody likes to have something crappy said to them. Nobody likes that. And so honor that that's coming up for you and be like, you know what? Of course I have parts of me that are upset by that. And maybe you might need to take some time journaling that out because there might be some other stuff that's getting triggered here. In fact, there probably is, especially if you're, past 15. You probably have memories of when people made fun of you or said awful things that are getting triggered here. Or maybe you even have bigger stuff than that, like in your family. And it's triggering this stuff. And that's why these parts are getting upset because they're like, oh, we've been down this road before. It doesn't go well. It doesn't feel good. So we want to be able to work with that. And there's ways that we can do that in our journaling. But we work with that part and then we can say, you know what? Yeah, this is valid. We're going to work with it. And then after you do some work with it, you get to a place where you're like, you know what? This is all valid and I've got this now. I've got the tools now to be able to address this situation. So how do I want to respond to this? And there's lots of ways to respond to haters. Sometimes it's just best to delete because it's like, this just isn't even relevant. Sometimes they have legitimate comments that they're pointing out. And there's opportunities on TikTok. If someone says something that is, maybe not nice, we can do a video respond to their comment, or I even just like making a new TikTok about it because it kind of dials down the intensity on the emotion. So then it's not like this back and forth, like, I don't know, like pissing match around what they said and your response to it. But instead it's like, oh, this is an area where I can share more information, where I can clarify what I'm saying. It's a point to address because a lot of times when people are saying something hateful or seems like they're saying something hateful or something negative, beneath them attacking our character, attacking what we said, is a valid complaint. So if we can work through our feelings, get ourselves regulated using some of those regulation skills I talked about earlier, make sure you check the show notes for volcano breathing. That's my favorite one. If you can't go for a walk or something to get us regulated from our fight or flight response. But it actually also works from the shutdown response too, because it is movement. So be sure to check that out. But once we've done that somatic work to get our body regulated and we've worked through those emotions, then we can figure out how to address the concern that's beneath the negative energy that person put out. And sometimes it might just be like, not worth it, especially if that person's not in your audience, or especially if other people in your audience see how ridiculous that is and just don't need that piece explained to them. But sometimes they do. And so we can take this as an opportunity to be like, oh, you know what? This is more content for me. I don't have to be upset about this. I mean, you can be if you want to, but maybe only be upset about it as long as you need to motivate yourself to do the work of adding extra content, right? Instead of laboring over the upset and getting stuck with it, or worse, suppressing it and being like, it's fine, I don't care about the haters. And then eventually you just keep suppressing it and you don't deal with those feelings. And then one day someone says something and you're like, "Wah!" and you freak out because you haven't been addressing the issues that are coming up as they come up. So I hope this is making some sense. I hope this is useful, that you can do this with anything. It doesn't just have to be, content haters. But if you're a woman entrepreneur, or even if you're a woman, especially with ADHD, because we tend to say stuff that offends people a lot, especially when we blurt out or say something impulsively, or just in general, the way our brains work are different than neurotypical brains. So I don't know about you, but we often end up pissing people off inadvertently. This is a really important skill to have, whether you're in business for yourself or you're just walking around human. So I hope you try these things out. I would love it if you commented on the podcast, or, share about the podcast with others, because I'd really like to get the word out and help as many people as I can. Also, if you have questions for me, please ask them in the comments, or you can DM me on Instagram at I_am_Jen Barnes. I can't remember if there's an underscore before Jen or Barnes. I'll put it in the show notes. So be sure to follow if you're not already, and take care.